Okay, so welcome to everybody who has dialed in. We will start with introductions and the objective for today's session. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Tiziana Perrella. I'm a professional trustee. My background is actuarial, but I have worked on full-time settlement projects since 2008 for a number of major consultancies. And in my professional career, I have completed over 200 buy-in and buy-out transactions, ranging in size from under $1 million to about 4 billion. Charles?
Good afternoon. My name is Charles Ward. I'm a professional trustee, portfolio of around 7 schemes. And I lead Dalriada's approach to settlement exercises and related activity. My personal experience includes recently working with a number of sponsors to take smaller schemes through full scheme buy-ins and through to buy-out, with prior advisory experience of working on longevity swaps and the use of captive insurance for larger schemes. The objective of today's session is to talk about the key considerations for trustees in connection with settlement projects. In particular, we'll talk about how we can work with employers to deliver successful projects that meet everyone's objectives, as well as how we can work with our advisors to streamline processes, working collaboratively with us and our fellow trustees to demystify the process. But first of all, I'll hand over to Tiziana to talk us through what's happened in 2020.
Thank you, Charles. So just a brief perspective on the market as we understand it now. First of all, just confirming the insurer results are out, and 32 billion worth of bulk annuity transactions were completed last year. And in addition to that, there was 24 billion of longevity swap. Now, this was smaller total value of bulk annuities compared to 2019. 43 billion was actually written in 2019, but this was mostly due to fewer jumbo deals, where jumbo deals are defined as those above $1 billion in size. And 2019 was absolutely an exceptional year in this respect. Maybe interesting to note that the number of transactions over the last 3 years has actually remained very similar at around 150 transactions per year. So the question is, why is the market so resilient? And really, there's good reasons for that. On the insurer supply side, there's good appetite, which is driven by expectations of steady returns, but also the ability from insurers to source appropriate assets. And on the demand, so on the scheme side, better funded schemes, there's legacy arrangement issues, including the difficulties in finding lay trustees and the ever-increasing governance burden for DB schemes. So as a result of this, the number of schemes with an explicit end game of buyout actually increases every year. And although there are additional opportunities to settle, for example, there's consolidator vehicles, there's partial insurance solutions available from the insurance market. The bulk annuity transaction remains the gold standard. And so we expect demand to remain high or actually to increase, which is good news really for trustees, but also, of course, for members and also for sponsors that ultimately pay for the transactions. Now, one thing to note is that although markets have been volatile, market volatility means pricing opportunities. So, for example, the credit spreads that we saw last March, April, presented good opportunities to transact at an attractive price for schemes that were in the market then or ready to move quickly. So as trustees, really, one of the key messages is that these opportunities will arise again, and we need to be ready to take them. And we won't be able to do that unless we have also on side a proactive advisory team that will support us to move quickly when the opportunity arises. And another kind of statistic is that at the current time, insurers are turning down as many as 50% of the quotation requests that are coming their way. But one important point is that this is not across the piece. For example, the smallest case that we have in the market at the current time, and actually there should be a quotation coming my way today, we absolutely had no difficulties in getting the market interested. So the message remains that this kind of theme of preparation, but what does this mean in practice for trustee? And where is trustee input most required, at which point? And we are planning to cover this in a little bit more detail in the rest of this session.
Thanks, Tiziana. So against this very busy market, there's clearly a challenge for trustees in accessing the market effectively and getting the best value deal for both sponsors and our members. How do we access that market effectively?
Well, any advisors on this call will absolutely know and understand that this is not an overnight exercise. There's a lot of preparation that goes into it. And it starts really deciding that this is the right strategy for the scheme. The timing also needs to be good, and all stakeholders need to be lined up to execute a transaction. And just to make it clear, the stakeholders here, although obviously this is for the benefit of the members, but the stakeholders in terms of making decisions are the employers, our fellow trustees, but also the scheme advisors. And really, you need to have all these parties focused on the same goals. Otherwise, the process is likely to not to end well and be quite disappointing for everybody, and not to mention a lot of costs will have been incurred unnecessarily.
Okay. And in your experience, how do trustees decide on whether to look at a transaction at all?
Well, everything really starts a lot earlier than the time that you go to market, and that can be a number of months, but sometimes can be a number of years. And really, when we first get involved in any scheme, the first job is for us to work alongside the employers to agree both explicitly the end game strategy, but also to have a plan on how and potentially when we're going to get there. Now, the trustees really have got a key role here, because they need to speak to the sponsor, but also at the same time keeping the advisors engaged in connection with the detail of the agreed strategy. And as I've said before, the ultimate goal really is always maximising security for members' benefits. But taking into account the sponsor's circumstances does not go against this goal, and in fact is probably likely to be really beneficial. I think that once it's clear what this strategy is, it's again very beneficial to also document it, because then it can be communicated more clearly. And by communication, I mean at all levels. For example, sometimes the administrators get forgotten in all of this. And it's very important, because actually a lot of the work will require the administrator input. And sometimes the link between the consultants and the administration function is not as good as you would hope. And particularly there may be difficulties if they are from different firms. So again, I think that there is a role for the trustees to play here in terms of coordination of the communications. And we all know that there's a lot of schemes where funding is maybe not as good as should be. And because there are other issues, it's an easy excuse to delay considering the end game strategy. There will be plenty of other priorities alongside funding. But yeah, there are a lot of preparatory activities that can be undertaken alongside other work. And given that the new funding regulations will absolutely focus attention in this area, schemes that are already prepared and have started working on their endgame strategy and the detailed plan will be ahead of the game, which obviously can only be a good thing. So I think that once we have agreed the strategy, really the next step for me would be when to start an exercise. Do you want to pick this up, Charles?
Yeah, sure. So I think the question on when to start looking at this is around transaction structure. Are we looking at a big bang approach of fully buying out the scheme once funding is sufficiently good? Or are we looking to take chunks of liability out of the scheme through multiple buy-ins on the journey towards full buyout? A lot of this depends on the risk appetite of the sponsor, which is obviously then linked to the underlying covenant. So very important for us as trustees to understand that covenant and the impact of various circumstances, and set up a structure so that over time, when you look at covenant and degree of funding in the scheme, we remain on track for whatever we've agreed with the sponsor, whether that's the big bang transaction or the smaller transactions on the way. With the single buyout, that means that investment risk can be run for a bit longer in the expectation that that will ultimately reduce the cash cost of the transaction. Typically, multiple buy-ins means a bit less emphasis on necessarily transacting at the best time in every single case. The downside is clearly that there's an increased cost of going through these exercises multiple times, and there's an opportunity cost in terms of limiting the amount of additional asset returns you can generate to get you to that full scheme buyout level. So very important really that we engage with the sponsor to understand their objectives, whether that's getting to the end game as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible, or with maximum certainty. The other key area to look at when thinking about timing is really to understand the demographics of our schemes. This is where advisors can really help us to understand the mix of gender, age, the benefit structure, any concentration of risk in particular groups of members, and retirement patterns, because all of that will impact on which insurers we approach and how we approach them. There are also good advisors out there that have the tools that help us as trustees look at these populations through this lens and allow us to make sensible decisions and consider different scenarios. It also importantly helps us demystify the topic for fellow trustees. One thing I think it's easy to forget is that our co-trustees will probably only go through 1, 2, maybe 3 buy-in exercises in the entire time as trustees. So it can be a very daunting process. So all of the information and the support we can gather from advisors really helps us to bring them on board and make sure the whole process is efficient. I guess from my perspective as trustee, the question as to when we're ready to go, it comes back to confidence. We need confidence that everyone's ready to go, that there's a clear view of what the timescale is and what the objectives are for what we're about to do. So I guess that brings us to the stage where we have the trustee board with employer support deciding to proceed. The next question is, how do we do this? They are complex exercises and need input from many different stakeholders. So what should a trustee board be thinking about at this stage, Tiziana?
So the key areas are, and I set them out in this order, but it's not necessarily the order of importance, the investment strategy, data quality, a comprehensive benefit specification which is suitable for broking, but then also the overall governance and project management needs to be in place. And in terms of investments, you would, or schemes would, normally hedge interest rate and inflation first, because that carries a bigger volatility and risk. And this can be a complex area, particularly for lay trustees sometimes. So you do need support from advisors in deciding which basis, but also in understanding the basis for hedging. So a hedging on your assets, your liabilities, if it's the liabilities, which liabilities. And also importantly, hedging needs to be dynamic, because obviously the position will change and your hedging needs to change with that. Also, schemes need to ensure that they have sufficient unencumbered, so unleveraged assets to support a transaction. And this means having clarity in advance as to what assets you will use to fund the transaction. And there is an important role for trustees in the disinvestment process and changing the investment strategy in advance of a transaction if that is required. There's practical steps. For example, sometimes signatory lists are not up to date. The timescales can differ. For example, if you have a small disinvestment versus disinvesting the whole of the assets. And even at a basic level, which sometimes it can get missed, some smaller schemes don't have electronic banking. And so you may want to make some changes and some adjustments to what you do in order to have an efficient process later on. Another comment I think on investment that is worth making is if you've got any fiduciary investments or if you've got any liquid assets, really they need separate consideration, because you don't want to lock in any losses and also the process for this investment may be more complex and time consuming. And I think that really, if you have decided that your strategy wants certainty along the way, and so you're going to go for multiple buy-ins, what you would want is the integration with just progressive de-risking. So have a de-risking and triggers. They also take into account potentially going to market for a partial buy-in. And in this respect, you do need to have a clear goal in mind. What is the minimum size of transaction that will deliver significant de-risking to your scheme? A 300 million scheme will not de-risk 50 million at the time, but a 60 million scheme may want to do that. And I think it's really important to have a specialist investment advisor early on if you have an incumbent that does not have specific expertise, and they can either replace or potentially even better work alongside. And I think that sometimes there can be tension. And so again, the trustees need to be alert to this, and they also need to be able to challenge their investment consultants if required. Charles, do you want to take on the next item on my list, which was the benefit specification?
Sure. I think the benefit specification, the first point to make is that it is never too early to start drafting it. Once it's done, it can be kept for future use, not only useful for buyout, but also a validation of what the scheme currently does, and helps to uncover any potential issues that might need to be resolved further down the line, better dealt with sooner rather than later, while we still have time to do that. I think secondly, the benefit specification needs to be a collaborative effort between the trustees, the scheme actuary who's valuing the benefits in the valuation, scheme administrator to make sure that the administration is in line with what we think the administrator is doing, and obviously then legal review from the scheme lawyers. I think one area of concern for us as independent trustees can be some loss of historic knowledge around scheme benefits, particularly discretions. So having those codified in a benefit specification is really valuable to us. Clearly, we can draw on the experience of the scheme actuary and legal advisor if that knowledge isn't written down somewhere, but clearly far better to have that written down in the first place. And important that we do codify those discretions and understand them before we go anywhere near the insurers to make sure that we're clear on what we're asking the insurers to price. And in particular, consider those where employer input is required, do some work around the cost implications and agree the approach to that with the employer. Ultimately, we see the benefit specification as a core part of the suite of tools that we as trustees use to manage the scheme over time. So as I said earlier, never too early to start on that. So that hopefully deals with the benefits that are to be paid. The next question is to think about the underlying data. How would you go about looking at data, Tiziana, in an exercise like this?
Well, first of all, my comments would be on the common and conditional data checks the schemes have to apply. They're good, as in they give an indication of data quality, but they are absolutely not sufficient to decide whether a scheme is good enough in terms of data to go to market. It's way too high level. I would always recommend a benefit audit. Clearly, that needs to follow after the benefit specification has been prepared and signed off. Now, the benefit audit can have a varying scope. You don't have to go back and recalculate benefits from scratch for all members, but certainly you can choose some sample members, for example, different categories, different sexes, different NRAs, and also check things as any spreadsheets, calculation routines, or templates that have been used in the past. Now, one important point, I think, is who does this work. Because the incumbent can be best placed, but they probably are very busy. So you may see if they've got other resources from other teams, or potentially even call in a third party. And there are who are independent and have the expertise to be able to be, parachuted in and do this work quite efficiently. This work sometimes, ends up being done in a hurry, just before you go to market, or even worse, after you've done a transaction and you're trying to go to buyout. And it's important to note that insurers are shortening the implementation timelines in the contracts. So really my challenge would be, well, why do it in a hurry later on when actually, you can start it early, and that makes sense, and it will give you more certainty, on pricing and timescales to buy out later on.
Absolutely. So we're in this great scenario. We've got perfect data, comprehensive benefit specification, supportive sponsor. Where do we go with all of that?
Well, I think that if trustees have not appointed a formal settlement advisor or broker, they should absolutely do that at this stage. This really should be somebody with experience and specific experience to the size of transaction that you are seeking, if possible, and hopefully somebody that has good credibility with the insurance providers who end up being the other stakeholders once the scheme is actually in the market. We would expect the settlement advisor to be absolutely crucial and a trusted partner for trustees. And there's loads of aspects really that they can provide guidance either in advance or during or as part of the advisory process. Just quickly running through a list. Really provide information on what the bulk annuity market looks like. What is the relevant market segment in which insurers are likely to be interested, taking into account the size of transaction that we are seeking. And it needs to be noted that the definition of small schemes has changed significantly. Small schemes used to be 20 million, 30 million, now 100 million transaction will be probably considered at the smaller end. Also, it's important to understand some key size transactions that some insurers will not go under. And again, that could be around the 20, 30 million or 80 to 100. So you may want to decide on a size, not just taking into account the other factors that we've already mentioned, but also you may not want to miss on some insurers that may be interested if you just go a little bit bigger. As you've said earlier, Charles, just having a good understanding of what your population looks like. So what pension increases, what is the duration compared to other schemes? And is this going to be attractive to which insurer? Approach to in-specie transfer, if there is the potential to transfer in specie, that can be beneficial. What price lock are you looking, and what are insurers able to offer? What are they doing in terms of GMP equalization? If you are not going to secure cost-neutral insurer factors, how much can you flex? And then, various other things, for example, could be interested in post-transaction member options, which sometimes can be accommodated. And last but not least, really understanding the admin model of the insurer, given that you will be at some point handing over responsibility, for decades. And more importantly, or more relevant recently, rather, is the insurer approach to ESG type factors. And really, all this is the responsibility of the broker to guide trustees, but it is the responsibility of the trustees to choose whether they proceed with the transaction or not, and select a counterparty. And if you have advanced knowledge and clarity, obviously making decisions will be faster and will be hopefully better. So really, my closing point is that I want to reiterate what we've already said a few times. You really need to plan ahead, and it's never too early to start if you want to buy out.
Thanks, Tiziana. So that brings us to the end of the main session. We've got 5 or so minutes left for questions. Susan, can I ask if we've got any questions that we can pick up before the end?
We don't have any live ones, but we have a couple of pre-submitted ones that we could run through. Okay. And if anybody wants to submit while we're chatting those through, then please do go ahead within the question and answer box or the chat box. So the first question we've got is, if you could give just one piece of advice for such an exercise, what would it be?
I'll take that. For me, it would be never, ever, ever go to market speculatively. Trustees should be 100% clear on what their objectives are, but also whether these are likely to be hit. You can always have surprises, but really you should. They should be few and far between. And in order to get there, you need to work alongside your consultant and your broker, as I've just said. But again, remembering that you don't need to be dictated by them, and you also need to bring the sponsor on board with that.
Okay, and then the second question that we have here was pre-submitted was, should GMP equalisation exercises be done in advance of a market approach?
I'm happy to pick that one up. So I think the high level answer is it's very likely to make the scheme more attractive to insurers, but there's always a but. But you do need to be mindful of specific scheme circumstances. So if you're looking at conversion, for example, you need to be very aware of tax-related issues, fixed protection issues. So although the general answer is yes, GMP equalisation, particularly conversion, can be very attractive to the insurers. Again, it comes back to this planning point. Think about your population, think about the potential impacts of GMP equalisation on that population, and then use that information to decide on how and who you approach for a quote.
Okay, and we've got another question that's come in here live this afternoon. So, how important are an insurer's ESG credentials in your view? Could they ever trump price?
I'll take that. That's a really interesting question. I think that they might, depending on, again, your population. I think that there is an expectation from members that this is an important factor. For example, if you're in surplus, you may go for somebody who is slightly more expensive, that has more conviction in terms of the credentials. I think it will be a difficult conversation with the sponsor if you're asking the sponsor to put more. But then the other important point to make is that there is increasing evidence that schemes with good ESG credentials, that companies that have clear ESG credentials do better financially. So it could be that you think that a company that's more invested in this will do better in the future, given that we are looking for buyouts. We're looking at a population that could be alive, last pensioner could die, in 40, 50 years. Again, that may be an important consideration. Would it trump price the majority of times? I don't think that's ever going to be the case, but that's not to say that sometimes it may not do so.
One final question that's come in live this afternoon. What's the most important quality you look for when you're selecting your scheme's advisor for such an exercise?
I'm happy to take that. For me, is absolutely experience and credentials. This is an important, most important decision probably that a trustee will make, and really, unless you have 100% belief that the consultant that you have chosen is going to deliver the absolute best that the market can offer at that point, I think you will need to reconsider potentially. I don't know if you want to add to that, Charles.
No, I completely agree with that. I think you're right. It's the credibility and the confidence that we get that advisor will take us all the way through, and it's not just the exciting buy-in transaction, but it's just as important to get us right through to wind up as well for those schemes doing a full scheme buyout. Okay, so we're at 4 o'clock. So I think on that basis, we will call it to a close. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.